first piece I'd like to read is called, it's called Necrophilia. When Harold Pinter, one of my favorite playwrights who won the Nobel Prize for Literature, died in 2008, I was devastated, even more so than my father's passing away 3 years earlier. I think the force of feeling has something to do with what I think of as the architecture of the moment, which was, as I read the news online, I was being looked at, or I thought I was being looked at by a dreadfully abused copy of Pinter's Complete Works, Volume 1, which I'd had for years. It was sitting on my bookshelf, directly at eye level, just inches above my laptop monitor. In retrospect, I can say that the book's decay, that it was old, worn out, dog-eared. That particular aspect had an effect of an aphrodisiac. It really turned me on. It put me in the mood, so to speak, to worship Pinter or re-worship him, more than I had done when he was alive. So later that day, I wrote something, a short piece of prose that was somewhat inspired, that I thought was somewhat inspired by Pinter's style of subtle menace. What does it take to make a memory succulent? Take an apple and an orange, and maybe some grapes, with the caveat that all are overripe. Even better if they are damaged or cauterized, without which there can be no full sentences in recall. But what you do when all the trees are bare, when let alone fruit, there's not a leaf to be had, what's a memory to become? I was grieving not just Harold Pinter, the playwright, but belatedly my father. That was 3 years after he had died. 3 years previously, I was woken up by a transatlantic phone call in the middle of the night. At the time, I lived in Chicago, and my father died here in Mumbai. In the aftermath of that news, I realized I owned nothing concrete of my father, not even a measly little photograph. There was nothing to look at and mourn his death, so I decided to invent a photograph, or something like it. I used the tip of a Swiss Army knife and made a small cut on my chin. It was very minor damage, but deep enough to leave a very small scar. Now that I think of it, or ask myself, why did I cut myself? It was because the night was really quickly slipping away from me, and I wanted a keepsake to relive that night anytime I wanted in the future. Clearly, that cut on my chin wasn't enough of a keepsake, because now back in Mumbai, I found other perverse ways to resuscitate my father. I make special trips to what I think of as living ruins. I visit the filthy streets of the Fort Market area behind BT Station, where he trawled amidst the evening vegetable sellers and picked out the best fruit, the freshest green leaves. I prowl the footpath under the beautiful but condemned Watson's building in Kalaghoda, where he had a small office, and wonder, as I did when he was alive, when will this building come caving down? Sometimes I stalk strange men dressed in white, because my father wore white. Every day, an impeccably white bush shirt, as they were called in those days, and white trousers. I follow these men to study their clothes and observe if they compete with my father's perfect attire. Of course, I'm hoping to find imperfections, because the tiniest blemish, the tiniest wrinkle will instantly summon him in Technicolor. I suppose this is a kind of love, but when I'm being sensible, my actions just feel completely idiotic, because the only cues that really vividly evoke or invoke my father, who, God rest his soul, was a completely obsessive, self-controlled perfectionist, are flawed things. That is, the things that are completely exactly his opposite, relive his memory. But as an optimist, I like to think that everyone else around me is equally bonkers, that we all at some point seek very beautiful memories in ruined things, like this defunct building, for instance, which, after lying unused for years, has suddenly become worthy of performance and art, as if the only way to preserve its memory is to show it a good time. I think this is a pretty kinky relationship to have, because it's with something that's essentially dead. That the moment someone decides to demolish the ruin or bury the corpse, so to speak, one begins to covet it, have feelings for it, feel compelled to get intimate with it. In psychiatry, there's a term for the sexual attraction to corpses. It's called necrophilia. And I suppose to me, making a memory is a bit like sleeping with the dead. So that was the slightly autobiographical piece, or very autobiographical piece, depending on how you look at it. And the second piece I'd like to read is a very, very short piece of fiction. It's called Bait, B-A-I-T. At 3 o'clock, there was a power failure. The funeral home plunged into darkness at the instant Johnny Falcone's father's coffin entered the furnace. Everything but the coffin crackling away under the flames was obscured. As Johnny fumbled in the darkness, he knocked over a vase, tripped on a rug, and went flying on something hard. On waking, a sharp light was piercing his right eye into which two men stared deeply while pulling away his eyelid from his eyeball. His first thought was about the men. They were extremely peculiar to look at, peculiar not for their beady eyes and bird-like cocking of the head, but because they were exactly alike, though one wore green, the other a blue suit. But of course, it was the twins. The two undertakers who ran the funeral home where he had booked his father's funeral were now examining his forehead as though it was hatching an alien creature. Johnny saw the pointy end of a finger approach his forehead and descend on what must have been a very sensitive area because pain made him yelp and reflexively swat the man in green. The man in blue was checking his pulse. Johnny let himself be checked, but kept an eye on the man in green. "You've had a concussion," said Blue. "A concussion?" asked Johnny. "A concussion. It's a stunning, damaging, or shattering effect from a hard blow, especially a jarring injury of the brain resulting in disturbance to cerebral function," explained Green, who had looked up the word on his cell phone and was reading out the description from the Merriam-Webster's dictionary. "You fed on the Chippendale there," he said, pointing at a cottage chest. Johnny noticed the edge was sharp enough to shame a samurai sword and winced. Green continued talking. "You bled. Look, stains on the varnish. We can have those cleaned up, but you'll need stitches." "What about my father?" asked Johnny. "Is he—" "Yes, he's all gone, I'm afraid, Mr. Falcone," said Green. "You missed the fireworks. But we have him for you." "Here," said Blue, placing on Johnny's chest a ceramic jar with the word coffee on it. "Your father's in that ceramic jar, Mr. Falcone, minus the bones." Johnny's head ached as he looked at the jar, letting his eyes rove over the word coffee. He wondered what to say. Was it appropriate to question these two completely whacked-out men who looked like they were distant cousins of Mr. Bean? Or should he simply get up, accept the jar, and pretend that all was fine? Well, perhaps they were not distant cousins of Mr. Bean, after all, because Blue began apologizing profusely, and better still, in absolutely comprehensible words. "The power failure completely shut down our system. We can't get into our closets, where we stock our usual containers for the ashes, for the remains. So we had to improvise," said Green. "Improvise?" asked Johnny. "Yes, we thought since your father was a chef, and you're one too, he would not mind that we put him in that," said Blue, pointing to the word coffee on the jar. "We thought the food connection was fitting." Later on the bus, Johnny made a mental assessment of everything he would need for the special funeral meal he had planned. Flour, check. Eggs, check. Oil, check. A hunk of cheese, check, check. Nothing was nearly good, as it could be without cheese. Back home, Johnny quickly dispensed with the idea of stitches to his head and began work on the dough for the ravioli. The ravioli was the funeral meal that he had planned. If he had a calling, it was something like ravioli. The planning of a city, a grid city of uniformly perfect squares, where no one thing claimed the prize to beauty. Johnny looked at the clock. 5 o'clock. Only 2 more hours before his weekly ritual. Every Friday, Johnny went fishing to the north end of the lake. Only 2 hours to make the ravioli then. In his white kitchen, the afternoon light lay halfway across the counter, like a watching person. From time to time, moving further away until it was draped only partially on the counter, and mostly on the floor. Johnny found it refreshing to have such a friend who did not ask questions, proffer advice, or air unsolicited opinions. In fact, the company pleased him so much, he decided to share with it his special recipe for ravioli. For the dough, you begin by cleaning up the kitchen counter. It has to be clutter-free. Choose a thick flour for a strong dough. Remember, ravioli are like pockets that carry things. In a well of flour, break some eggs and dribble in some oil, swirl together, as if this is how friendships are made, in a place out of which there is no way out. Then you mix and knead until a ball forms. It feels like love to have one's hands around such a perfect form. After these instructions, the curious person of light departed. The dough ball was covered and left. It was evening now. The sun, a circle at the west, was a fruity orange. Johnny set the alarm and wandered into the balcony. It was time to chat with the birds that lived in the mulberry trees. Their leaves were splintered by grackles, black, purple, black, and black gold. You could never tell which color the grackles were. After 20 minutes of chatter, Johnny was back at work, rolling the dough into thin sheets. He held one up and made an approving sound. It was susceptible to light, but firm enough to hold up on its own. Then, while each sheet dried on the back of a chair, Johnny stepped out for a second round of talk with the birds. Stories of his father came tumbling out. He was surprised the birds wanted to listen. Finally, the alarm went off, letting Johnny know to squire the pasta sheets back onto the kitchen counter. He set a large pot of water to boil and only then reached for the ceramic container with the word coffee on it. It was either then or never. He emptied out the ashes into a wide steel bowl. The ashes fluttered and settled, leaving along the bowl's upper edge a fine white dust, the color of a prouder gray cat. Slowly but methodically, Johnny wept and spooned his father's ashes in tiny mounds set side by side onto the pasta sheet. When all the ash was gone, he placed a second pasta sheet over the first. Pressing down from the top, along the margins of the mounds, he formed an angular graveyard of pre-cut ravioli. Under a rolling knife, minus the traditional frilled cut, square after square came away, capably, for Johnny knew no other way. He secured the four sides of each pocket by pressing at the edges to avoid any unwanted slits. It was a necessary precaution. When the ravioli cooked, they would fight the water. But water was like grief. Give it an inch, and it gets into everything. Then, as a rumble of air bubbles broke the surface in the pot of boiling water, in went the ravioli. They sank. He waited. They rose. They glittered, ugly, a flock of urban pigeons buoying up to the sky. The ravioli was strained and stood to let off steam. Slowly, he took his time, watching them surrender their heat for stodgy warmth. For a moment, he thought he saw something trembling. Trembling, of course. How could they not? He himself was trembling. When he was certain they had settled down and were ready for their task, he went to the closet and drew out his two favorite fishing lines and a box with the word bait on it. Yes, Dad, he said to the little pockets of ravioli, that is what you are, fish food. Johnny shredded some cheese on the ravioli before placing them one by one inside the box on a folded piece of foil. When he headed out to the lake, he was smiling for the first time in hours. It was perfect weather to go fishing. The end.
Well, as Parmesh said, I've been coming to the Culture Lab regularly now for the past 2 weeks, and I've thought of it as an excellent forum to put forth my opinions and observations. Now, this one here is more of an observation than an opinion. Welcome to Mumbai, the celebrated city of dreams, which is also known as Slumbai. Here, while you chase your favorite dreams, the city provides you with the very facility that makes your life smooth, your own personal maid. She comes with her efficient broom and wipes away the city's dust so that you come back to a spotless home. Mumbai's maids are world famous and come in many types. There are the morning-only maids, the 9-to-5 maids, the eternal maids who never seem to leave your house, the sly maids, and the extremely expensive maids. The most common types of maids are the ones whose kids never seem to be ill. Now, what intrigues me is an observation I made. It's a fairly common observation and holds true for most households I've visited in the city. First of all, everyone has maids over here. It's common. And second of all, maids are constantly treated as persona non grata, people of no consequence. What I have found most commonly is that people observe such things, but are extremely hesitant in taking notice of them. They don't want to ask the wrong questions. Take this hypothetical scenario. While stopping at a red light signal, you see a middle-aged woman with a crying baby. She's begging. Most of us would instantly put a rupee or 10 rupees to her. Society approves of this. Now consider this other scenario. You're taking a stroll outside your building when you meet the same lady you met on the road earlier. This time, she urgently implores you to hire her. She has a child to look after and an absentee alcoholic husband. You feel like a soft target. Suddenly, you find yourself helplessly searching for a nice way to refuse because she doesn't look trustworthy. But you can't just turn her away, so you let her in your home sweet home. When you take her to your house, you notice that you give her strict instructions immediately. No touching this, no touching that, no sitting on my sofas, no switching on my TV, no sitting on my bathrooms. Don't you think this is another form of apartheid? How are the maids considered dirty, unsanitary, and inferior, but allowed to cook our food? How are they allowed to set our untidy rooms, but not allowed to spend time in them alone? Double standards, anyone? We talk democracy and simultaneously practice an archaic, conservative, and strict social caste system. It's a problem which is like the elephant in the room, something we need to get to the bottom of. So how do we bell this cat? How long will this go on? Will our servants produce another set of servants, a seemingly never-ending line of servants? Will they produce armies for their children to depend on us? I frankly don't think so. Every buy and driver I know is sending their children to a school. It could be an English medium school or a Marathi medium school. Their children will surely move up a rung up the ladder of development, the ladder of a better life and higher standards of living. And on that high note of controlled optimism, I would like to end this talk.